Welcome to Morning Live, and thanks very much for joining us. I know that you're in our Cape Town studios.
Thanks very much.
Pregs, what is the current state of water and sanitation right now in the country?
What our report shows, Leanne, is that whilst the national averages have improved, when you actually disaggregate those averages down to provincial and local level, particularly in terms of the former apartheid homelands, townships and informal settlements of our country, that in fact the situation is quite dire in many parts where people do not have access to adequate water and decent sanitation. The impacts of that were illustrated yesterday when we brought two people from each of the provinces who had testified in our provincial hearings, as well as the family of Michael Komape, the little boy who died in the pit toilet in Limpopo, to come and bring their experience to government and to Parliament.
Now, let's dig a little bit deeper and find out exactly what came out of the public hearings that were hosted. The first thing was that the apartheid spatial geography is a persistent problem, that people who are in those areas still do not have access to many of the rights in our constitution. The other thing that came out, in fact, in the first hearing in Mpumalanga, the case of Carolina was brought, but these are cases that we've seen throughout the country, where most of South Africa's water, over 60%, for example, is used by agribusiness, and another significant proportion of South Africa's water is used by the mining industry and other industries, and they pay less per kiloliter than households do. The fact that even though there was a policy to ensure free services to people who are poor across our country, that policy has not functioned, has not been able to be successful. And the reality is that people who are poor households, are paying more per kiloliter of water in our country than wealthy companies do. We found also that people who are contracted to build schools with that should conform to minimum human rights norms and standards are not, and the case of the toilets, which are still pit toilets in many schools across the country, that many schools do not have proper access to water and sanitation. In 20 years into our democracy is an urgent matter. Yeah.
The reality that you have a lack of cooperation amongst government departments that are responsible, and coordination between different spheres of government. Whilst water and sanitation is a local government competency, the reality is that unless national and provincial abide by their legislative responsibilities and their constitutional responsibilities to ensure the right to water is maintained, and the right to equality, so that somebody who's poor living in a village should have the same access to the rights in our constitution as somebody who owns a mining company or a big agribusiness. The choices that are being made in terms of water wastage is a huge problem. So we are seeing that whilst government has looked at water wastage in poor areas and the dripping tap in poor communities is their symbol often, the reality is that most of the wastage is by big agribusiness. And here you're looking at questions of the way in which water is, the irrigation systems, the fact that most of our seed is now owned by global corporations like Monsanto, which use genetically modified seed. And the result is that it's actually costly to South Africa's farmers because they have to they buy the seed every year. It also means that the water that is being used is much more than would be if there was it was seed that was indigenous seed in our country, but it was also natural methods that were being used.
Pregs, I have to interrupt you there because we've run out of time, but I can't possibly end this interview without talking more about the bucket system. Because, you know, in the introduction we said 272,000 toilet systems are still in use in South Africa, and yet it is meant to be eradicated by government's own set target at the end of this year. Is this
Absolutely
possible? Is it possible?
It is
It is possible to have done this in terms of political will, and you're talking about the bucket system as well as the water infrastructure, which should have been fixed from 1994 because it was geared towards wealthy infrastructure, ensuring that water was being used by companies which use our dams, etc. And we say water is a human right. It's not just to be treated as a commodity. And you've got to shift the way in which people's dignity is upheld from the bucket system to the right to water and decent sanitation in every toilet, so that Michael Komape, who died, the people who live every day with the indignity of this of lack of water and sanitation, the people who are killed and injured because they stand up for their rights to water and sanitation, is unacceptable. I mean, the Commission brought an expert, a policing expert, to the Marikana Commission, who'd policed for 30 years, who'd been in charge of policing for 30 years in Ireland, in the worst periods of the violent protests. Never once did he order the use of live ammunition.
Pregs, unfortunately, I know it's such a big issue, but we've got to leave it there due to time constraints. Pregs Govender is the Deputy Chair at the SAHRC, the South African Human Rights Commission.